Take that a little bit further now. We're joined by Presidency spokesperson Vincent Magwenya, and we'll, of course, take your thoughts also tonight. 072-110-5584. Drop us an X at Newzroom 405. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming in.
Good evening, Tabo, and thank you for having me.
Did the president imagine that it will take this long for him to set up his cabinet? He's the head of the state, he's the head of the national executive, but he doesn't have an executive to head right now.
No, he did not have a timeline in mind. What he had was a commitment to act in good faith. What he had was a commitment to act in the best interest of the country, having heeded a very clear message and call from the voters to reach across the aisle, if you like, and work with other parties. That's what he had.
But did he have in mind the fact that bringing in these other parties, as Helen Zille seems to think, it curtails his exercise of power in terms of Section 91?
Well, I think he did not, think it will be easy. No one expected it will be easy. He went into the process believing, and he still does believe, that all parties are committed to moving the country forward, that all parties are committed to working together. That's what he had in mind. The political process was such that the invitation was open to other parties. It's a process that he fully supported, and currently he has been engaged in various consultations with parties that are signatories to the GNU to give effect to that commitment of a government of national unity as voters have directed.
Yeah. Giving regard to the role that is played by cabinet, that is played by the executive, running the country, making policy, implementing policy, so to speak, and directing and coordinating the work of government. Constitution might not stipulate when exactly the cabinet needs to be set, but it surely doesn't give carte blanche to just in perpetuity not have a cabinet.
No, there's always a degree of rationality that is required in how you effect various provisions of the Constitution and the law. Yeah. What we have currently is the president is vested with executive authority. The Constitution empowers him or gives them the prerogative to appoint cabinet. He will exercise that prerogative diligently. He's been working flat out to conclude the political process of consultations with GNU partners. He certainly does not want to prolong or to have a prolonged, rather, period of uncertainty. And so he wants to wrap up the consultation process as soon as possible. But it must be a process that is conducted in earnest, that is conducted in good faith. All parties must have a fair and reasonable opportunity to present their views, and he must be satisfied that he has taken on board, rather, all views and submissions that have been made to him before he can then exercise that constitutional prerogative.
What does that mean? What does it look like? I mean, there's a party that wants, I don't know whether there'll be 28 or however how many there will be these, but currently the ministries that are there, including the Ministry of Electricity, there are 28. There's one party that wants a piece of 11. How does the president look at that in proportionality?
Well, you'll recall the president had made a commitment to reduce the size of cabinet, and that process was well underway. The outcome of the elections has dictated otherwise. As I've said, there is now a political process that the president has to consider. Some of the consultations are just not over who takes what allocation, but they're over how do we implement the priorities of the 7th administration, which have also found expression in the statement of intent that the parties have signed on to. And so it's going to be important that you look at the work that needs to be done. And once there's alignment on that, you then take it a step further in terms of the capacity that then needs to execute. In this case, he's seized with the capacity in cabinet. I'm certain that when he announces his cabinet, you will see quite a strong alignment between the priorities of the administration and the cabinet that will be driving the execution of those priorities.
So priorities of the administration and priorities, for example, of partners in the GNU might not necessarily be the same thing, right? For example, if the priorities of this administration is to centralize the function of policing, right? The priorities for a federal democratic alliance is devolution of powers. So they would rather have those powers be filtered down to other province or to local government. How do you balance that in who you put in?
Well, some of these issues are already covered in the Constitution. So there's already a provision in terms of a single police force in the country. Some of these issues are issues that can be discussed and be looked at from a policy point of view. But what the president has in front of him, excuse me, currently, is that there is alignment based on the agreement around the statement of intent, the basic minimum program that is outlined in that statement of intent aligns with the priorities that he would like to see the 7th administration drive. And so there is already alignment.
But I don't think there is alignment.
Well,
because if the DA comes and he says, well, we are a federal party, so we'll come in and bring our policies that align with who we are. It doesn't tell me that there is alignment.
It doesn't work like that. I think we need to distinguish between political rhetoric. You're not going to have a case where all the party manifestos are going to find expression. And as I said, some of the issues are issues that are already well expressed within the Constitution. Some of the issues may be up for discussion, but there's no single party that will unilaterally decide to either change policy or change legislation or even amend regulations. It doesn't work like that. There are well-stated stipulations in terms of how do you go about amending the legislation, how do you go about amending regulations. And so those issues are not going to be handled in a unilateral sort of format. The different ministers from other parties that may be accommodated within the government of national unity will still be bound by the very same Constitution. When they take an oath after the appointment, they will take an oath and affirmation of their commitment to obey the Constitution. And so you're not going to have individuals within the GNU acting unilaterally as informed by their party manifestos. No, that's not going to happen. What will happen is that once the president has announced his cabinet appointments, that cabinet will soon sit for a cabinet lekgotla. At that cabinet lekgotla, there will be a detailed amount of work that will be done in terms of ensuring that there is alignment, but also going further in terms of how those priorities are executed. Some of them are already being executed in government, but it's a question of how do you accelerate. If you look at the reforms, for example, how do you accelerate some of the reforms that are already underway? So that will be the work that's done. No single party will act on their own. Yeah. But also, Thabo, just reference the fact that we've had ministers from other parties in the past, albeit different from the kind of structure that we envisage now in the form of a GNU. And those ministers did align with the respective administration priorities that were stated or outlined. So it's in a way, it's not something necessarily new. Yeah. So we should be able to have a cabinet that is cohesive, to have a cabinet that is fully aligned behind the priorities of the 7th administration.
So we're speaking of course, the national executive, but you were quick to point out that there's no paralysis in public administration. I want to take a break, and I want you to expand a little bit on that. What do you mean, and what are the implications, of course, following the letter that we've just seen around decisions that DGs would have been taking during this interim period, and how those are going to be handled when partners of the GNU come into effect. Right, what are your thoughts? Should President just go ahead, exercise his powers here, or must he give due consideration to the partners of the GNU, which are seemingly holding him down from making a decision of putting that cabinet in place? What are your thoughts? 072-110-5584. Drop us an X at Newzroom405. This as GNU negotiations are going forth, demands being leaked to the media, if you want to call it that, but certainly being made public. Now, one of the things that would have come up in the social media debates is the question of the paralysis of public administration, and you are quick to say, there's no problems. They're DGs, they're running departments, everything is going well. First question is, well, if administration can do such a great job, why do we need an executive authority?
Well, it's provided for in the Constitution. And as you know, there are very clear outlined responsibilities that the ministers have, which are signed by the president, as per, again, constitutional provisions. So what is important here is that you have a process that's going to lead to a formation of cabinet. In the absence of ministers and cabinet members, the work of government continues. And there is indeed no paralysis whatsoever in terms of government service delivery. So if you went to Home Affairs this morning, you will have been serviced. If there were teething issues, those will have been your typical operational teething issues that are not due to the absence of a minister, that have officials that can attend to. You do know that ministers have very specific executive authority duties that they have to perform that cannot be performed by your director generals. But at the moment, government is functioning very well. The executive authority lies with the president. If he requires any particular briefing or particular action, he can liaise directly with a director general of that particular department. And so our Constitution does not leave us in a vacuum in a process where you're transitioning from one administration to the next.
Is the president planning a trip out of the country anytime soon?
No, we have a very important political process that he's presiding over. That political process has to come to a conclusion. He will then need to announce his cabinet appointments. And as I've stated earlier on, importantly after that, Cabinet Lekgotla will have to sit to kind of map out how these priorities are going to be implemented. You will then have a sitting of parliament, a joint sitting of parliament, which the president is going to call, where he will then deliver the state of the nation address, if you like, which will then give an outline of how these priorities will be implemented. So up until those processes are undertaken, there is no plan for the president to leave the country anytime soon.
So what happens now in this instance where I want to read it so that I get exactly a sense of what is being said here in this letter of demand, which is now out in the public, that all tenders in departments reporting to Democratic Alliance ministers issued since the promulgation of the election date be reviewed. It is obviously not possible to effect change in a context where recent decisions by the previous government are rendered irreversible. That's a demand that they're saying. If there are decisions that will be taken now, once a Democratic Alliance minister takes over that portfolio, those tenders would need to be reversed.
So it's important to remind ourselves that we're a country of laws. And so it does not arise that because we are transitioning to a new administration, those laws are suspended and they're repealed. The issuing of a tender in a department will have been part and parcel of your sort of operational responsibilities as well as service delivery obligations. And so that tender will have been issued in accordance with provisions of the PFMA. There will have been a process to conduct a needs analysis, and the issuing of that tender will be linked to a clearly laid out departmental objective or goal around particular service delivery. And so in the absence of any proven wrongdoing or any proven violation of those governing regulations, it will be difficult to anticipate how those tenders could be reversed. And that's the beauty of our system. So But if there's proof that there was some form of violation in terms of regulations and those tenders were issued wrongfully, and again, you arrive at that having gone through due process.
Yeah.
You don't look at a tender and say, I want to cancel this tender. There has to be due process that precedes a decision to cancel a particular tender. So those processes will have to be engaged in the normal course of leading departments.
So I mean, it's not exactly that, but there's something akin to what is called fiscal dumping when it's end of the financial year and money is likely going to return to Treasury, and all of a sudden contracts are being issued and so on and so forth. So there is that possible concern that there could be people in those offices, which the DA would say would not listen to a DA minister, obviously seeing that they're about to lose their jobs, and issue out tenders to, I suppose, secure their future.
You know, public service administration is well stipulated in our Constitution. People don't just arbitrarily embark on a course of action in government. And so it is not necessarily accurate that you will find public servants that will disobey lawful instructions, right? Equally, public servants have a duty and an obligation not to obey unlawful instructions. And so there are very well laid out clear provisions in the Constitution in terms of the management of public administration. Equally, we have various public service codes that guide what can be done or cannot be done in the course of managing various government affairs. And so you're not going to have a case where decisions can be taken arbitrarily without engaging some form of process. A minister has a right to say, I want to, investigate or get more information as to how this procurement process was conducted. Officials will then provide that information in terms of how that procurement process was conducted. There are stipulations in terms of how government departments must conduct procurement processes. We have checks and balances in government in the form of the Auditor General. If they were, prior to elections, unlawful acts that violate various provisions of procurement or management of departments, those issues will come out and they will then be dealt in terms of due process, but they cannot be dealt in an arbitrary form depending on how I feel about you or I feel about the action that you took about 2 months or 3 months ago.
What does this mean in terms of appointments to other positions other than those of cabinet? There are certain positions that are appointed by the president. He, in his own powers, would, for example, in other instances, suggest a panel to give him a short list, and then eventually he would make a decision on who he appoints into those key positions. The Democratic Alliance saying now almost there will be some kind of a parallel process that will be run where it will have its own set of committee members that are aligned to the Democratic Alliance to make that decision, then go consult with the president and then come up with a short list from that, and whoever will be appointed seemingly is going to be done on consensus.
No, I think there's a broader commitment in terms of consensus decision-making in cabinet within the GNU framework. However, that does not mean that you then repeal or reverse constitutional powers that the president has to make certain appointments. It does not mean that you repeal existing legislative provisions in terms of how regulatory or legislative provisions in terms of how you recruit and appoint senior civil servants. Those are there. And all that needs to happen is for new ministers to familiarize themselves with those codes. But we need to correct the impression that prior to the 7th administration, government was just operating in some kind of unregulated do as you please form. No, the public service the public service and administration department has all these regulations laid out in terms of how you recruit, appoint, the various conditions of employment, and so on. And so it will be a case of new ministers having to familiarize themselves with those codes. But
it's not even that they're not there. It's the view that says that now in exercise of those regulations and those powers, there is this now extra thing of a statement of intent that has been signed with these parties that would require due process of consultation with all these people.
Now, of course, where the president needs to consult, he will consult. But I think we need to make a distinction that that consultation does not in any shape or form dilute his powers as they are derived from the Constitution or any other enabling legislation. That we must distinguish. And so politically, as a result of a political process outcome, you will have consultations. But at the end of the day, the president will be the one where he needs to apply his mind and make a decision, will be the one that does so as is empowered by the Constitution.
Is that not going to delay issues? As much as already President Ramaphosa is a consultative president, right? Even within their alliance partners.
He's a collaborative
president. Collaborative, let's put it that way, if you like. Yes. Is this now not going to make this process even more prolonged?
There will be a need to adapt to a slightly different way of managing cabinet, of managing various aspects of governance, and give effect to the spirit of the government of national unity, no doubt. However, voters are quite clear in terms of what they want. They want various service delivery components delivered and delivered now. People are looking for jobs. We need to grow the economy. And so you will find the president being quite stern in that all these processes are then not used to delay the work of government. And he will be quite stern in pushing ahead that even though you have to consult, you do not do so in a manner that then causes a paralysis of some sort in the process of government service delivery.
Thanks for staying on as we wrap up our conversation. Vincent Magwenya been so kind and indulging us to come into the studio to try and explain some of these issues very slowly so that we understand where the constitutional obligation sits right now with the, of course, arrangements relating to the GNU still being negotiated. It's clear that even though this is a negotiation that is happening around the government of national unity, considering that in our country, of course, national, province, local, they are not really the same thing, and one can't just jump into the other one and make decisions for that particular arm of government. What we heard now is that the president could have intervened in the announcement that was supposed to be made yesterday about the cabinet of the Gauteng province. What do you know about that?
Well, look, this whole process is a process that's being led by the governing party. And of course, the president is the president of the governing party, but I think it will be incorrect to say he will have acted alone. He will have acted as part of the collective, and obviously giving direction and leadership within that collective as it is expected. And so I did see a media headline somewhere on one of the publications claiming that the president personally intervened.
Said no, give the DA the positions.
That will be incorrect, because that intervention will have been within the context of the negotiating team that's leading that process. And that's interacting with various role players at provincial levels, where you need to form a government of provincial unity, so to speak. but the president is part of that collective. There was something slightly nefarious with that headline in the way it sought to isolate the president from the collective, which is not necessarily accurate.
There's, of course, that whole question around the allocation or proportional allocation. And how is that going to be approached? Because you would have a situation like in Gauteng now, where the party says, well, we've got 5, you've got 6. And so if a new partner comes into the provincial government of unity and we lose 1, you must also lose 1. How is the proportional allocation handled internationally?
I think maybe, Thabo, let me take you just a step back, because I suspect your questions are informed by this letter that's been doing the rounds, that all of you have seen and have read. And it's almost as if that has become the reference point or the benchmark in which talks and negotiations around the formation of cabinet within the context of the GNU are being held. And that's not necessarily true. We don't have a case where, and I'm overreaching here because I'm not mandated to speak to these processes. I'm here to speak from a perspective of the president. But you're not going to have the president listening to one party with respect to how cabinet needs to be formed. You're going to have the president engaging all parties, giving
irrespective of the size,
irrespective of their size, irrespective of their size.
Yeah.
His collaborative and inclusive approach is such that he is going to engage all parties equally, hear them out equally in terms of their views, their wishes, their thoughts around not only the allocation of seats, because we seem to be overly obsessed with that part. It's kind of understandable, that's where the hype is. But there has to be an expression around the priorities. There has to be an expression around what parties think with respect to how these priorities are going to be best effective.
But how do you balance that with the political party aspirations and demands? Because Gayton McKenzie says, what do you think? You think we are in this just to sign on the dotted line? No. We want power, and we want to exercise that power. And the fear is you've got now 10 parties all wanting to exercise that power because they are brought into the government of national unity. What is the glue that is going to
Again, you're assuming that every party has asked for a cabinet seat. That's the assumption you're making, and it may not be necessarily a correct assumption. Some parties may, for example, say, we do support the concept of the GNU in spirit and form, in terms of what it represents to the country and the people of South Africa. But that may not necessarily translate to that party saying we want a cabinet seat. You've had other parties express their desires in terms of the positions they would like to occupy in cabinet. Now, all of this the president has to balance. And this is where his leadership and astuteness will come in, because not only does he have to balance the wishes of individual political parties, he still has to balance the commitment for gender parity. He still has to balance the commitment to have young people in cabinet. So there are a lot of things that he has to balance, and this is where the exercise of his prerogative then comes in, because he will have heard all these different expressions coming from GNU partners. He will have had the leadership of the governing party. He will have had the alliance leadership. He will have had any other submission that may reach him. And when it's time for him, and for him alone, to then decide how he balances all of this, that's when he then exercises that prerogative. And it is a balancing act. And it is something that's not going to please everybody. It is an outcome that will have some people feeling aggrieved, because you cannot cater to every interest. Again, when we started the interview, I said, in the beginning, it's about what needs to be done. What's the work that has to be done for the benefit of South Africans? In his weekly newsletter today, the president was quite clear that these engagements around the GNU
and the based on position.
Should not be based on positions. And so that will be central in his thought process as he then makes the final decision.
Others might say it's trite because, of course, our constitution does not make provision for this. You've already quoted in your tweet, section 91. It speaks of a deputy president and deputy ministers and ministers, but deputy president, one. Yes. Have you canvassed that thought with the president on whether he would have an appetite for two deputy presidents, which others are saying it would mean an amendment to the constitution, because after 1996, the constitution said something different?
Well, all I can tell is that the president will be guided by the Constitution. In the exercise of his own duty, he's always guided by the Constitution. So he will be guided by the Constitution. I cannot speculate with respect to what his final decision will be with respect to specific areas of cabinet, but I can certainly say he will be guided by the Constitution in the exercise of his constitutional powers.
Yeah. I said this to you off air, but I'll say it again. There is a sense that if the president does not accede, right, to the demands of the DA, that this GNU is going to fall apart. One of the questions from our viewers saying, is the deal between the ANC and the DA irreversible or not? Should they not agree in ministry positions? What is binding the GNU agreement?
Well, what the president has experienced throughout this process is an unwavering commitment from all parties to move the country forward. And that is what has encouraged him in the various engagement that he has had. And he still believes that all parties, the DA included, are committed to making this GNU work. Not only now, in terms of how you arrive at a cabinet, but going forward, it has to be sustainable. Hence that commitment around the basic minimum program, and as well as the priorities for the seventh administration. And so the scenario of parties walking away, I suppose it's a matter of interpretation. It's how you've interpreted this letter, which again I will caution that we shouldn't use this letter as a benchmark and the only reference in terms of
read it more as a political posturing on the part.
Let's read it just as part of the politics around the process. Yeah. But what's currently taking place is much broader than what is in this letter, in the interest of the people of South Africa, which is what is first and foremost in the president's mind.
Let's circle, I suppose we should have started here, but it's fine. Having discussed everything else, let's circle back to this question. Is this a government of national unity? Does the president believe that? The EFF saying it's a falsehood of what he says is a government of national unity.
Well, the EFF, with respect, is not part of the process. And so what the EFF says, I suppose, could be confined in the space of political posturing that you see, which is part of our democracy in its robust nature and form. The president believes that it is a government of national unity. You now have, 70 or over 70% of voters represented in the GNU. And so it does represent the broadest sectors or sections of our society, if you like. And so there is no reason to question the fact that it is a government of national unity. And part of the motivation is not only to bring political parties together, but it's to bring South Africans together. It's for the whole country to come together and put shoulder to will in working with the government in the resolution of the various challenges that we are facing. And we've seen that. We have successful case studies of South Africans from various sectors coming together, working hand in hand with government in resolving some of the most pressing problems. One case study is the successes that we are seeing in the energy space, for example, where government sought to work with business and to work with other social partners in resolving our energy crisis. We've gone through some months now without any load shedding. And so we did it through during the COVID pandemic, where again you saw South Africans coming together in the fight against the spread of the pandemic and enabling an effective country's response to that pandemic. And so we are going to certainly, or the president is going to certainly lead an administration that is going to build on these successes and on these case studies. There's not going to be a case where there's the reinvention of the wheel, but we will be building onto this. And so the president is optimistic and confident that we will go through the hurdle of forming a government or cabinet.
By all means.
By all means,
so
we will.
Whether DA is there or not, by all means, it will eventually happen.
It will happen
because
with
there's
all
also
the
that
parties.
sense that the president seems to be tied to these 10, and therefore there is no appetite to even entertain those who are on the side, who are saying they are a progressive caucus.
Well, even if you look at that letter, right, which I'm saying don't concentrate on it too much. I think at the end of it, there's an expression of commitment towards making this government of national unity work. There is commitment to do what is right for all South Africans. And there is a recognition that no single party won an outright majority to govern. And so the sustainability of the exercise cannot rest on one party. It's a shared responsibility, obviously led by the party that has the majority of votes. And in the form of the administration, that will be the president. And so the president has no doubt that there's been any change in the level of commitment that he has experienced from the initial engagements with all the parties up until now. You will have, in the course of negotiations, parties expressing their wish list, and those wishes being shared in the public domain, as we've seen now. But that does not call into question the commitment of all parties to do what is right for the benefit of the country.
At a more personable level, I mean, is this the toughest negotiations the president would have ever handled? We know he was part of CODESA, he's handled a lot of other negotiations within his organization. This particular negotiation, is this the toughest one?
Well, I wouldn't call it the toughest one, but certainly it has its own fair share of challenges, and it has presented its own fair share of factors that the president will need to that the president needs to delicately and navigate. But certainly, I will say, and obviously coming from me, that as a country we are quite fortunate to have the president with his experience, having been involved in the negotiations that gave birth to the new dispensation in 1994. He is certainly drawing from that experience. The one area that you and your colleagues in the media often highlight as a weakness, that is too consultative, is the one strength that he has now, not for being consultative, but for being collaborative and understanding what is required to bring people of different persuasions together around a common objective. And so there is no better person really currently to lead and undertake that process with the kind of experience that he has, as well as the leadership traits that he often displays in terms of being inclusive, in terms of being collaborative. It is the kind of experience that will see the country through this process.
Vincent Magwenya, we appreciate your time and thank you very much for coming and speaking on behalf of the President.